The Galileo trial. Proof that science rules and religion drools. Right? Well, maybe, but let's take a closer look at it to see whether or not that's really what's going on here. Anyway, here's the story of the Galileo trial. There was a trial, and Galileo was right, but the medieval church tried to invade its way into science, so they tortured Galileo and burned him alive, which is an example of how religions are always trying to push their ideas onto scientists, and proof, if we needed any, that science and religion can't get along. Well, you'll forgive me for setting up a straw man argument, but let's take a look at some of these misconceptions, starting with number 1. There was a trial. In fact, there were 2. One in 1616 and another more famous one in 1633. In the first trial, Galileo was told to treat the idea of heliocentrism as a hypothesis rather than as the definitive truth. All scientific theories, we agree, are ways of explaining data. At first, Galileo agreed, but later he reversed himself and began to challenge the church's authority over what ideas he could and could not teach. Between those 2 trials, something happened, something important to our story. Urban VIII was installed as Pope, Pope Urban VIII. Unfortunately for everyone concerned, Urban VIII and Galileo started out as best friends. Next, was Galileo right? Well, he was right that the Earth orbits the Sun, but his solar system also contained many errors. Chief among them was his continued reliance on perfect circular motion instead of the elliptical orbits that Kepler would demonstrate in his laws. Galileo also taught, and this will be significant later on, that the tides were caused by different relative speeds of the moving Earth and the land and the sea moving. He didn't know about gravity. He knew about gravity, but he didn't know about Newton's theory of universal gravitation. So Galileo was right about some things and wrong about other things. He also thought that comets were events in the upper atmosphere. Again, science is self-correcting, and Newton would come along and fix some of these problems. But if you say that the church should have believed Galileo, oh, that's fine. But believed him on what? On everything? He wasn't right about everything. Next, was the church butting into a scientific matter where it did not belong? Well, in a way, maybe, but in a way, the opposite could also be said to be true. Galileo got into trouble for telling the church how to interpret Scripture, especially some passages from Joshua chapter 10. In 1615, Galileo wrote a letter to one of his students, Father Benedetto Castelli, proclaiming the truth of heliocentrism and stating that, quote, Scripture in physical disputes should be reserved to the last place. And you might totally agree with that, but is this a matter of the church butting into science or science butting into religion, or just both of them checking out their boundaries? Next, Galileo burned at the stake. Not true. Galileo, who was almost 70 by the time of the second trial, accepted the offer of the Inquisition to recant his public teachings, and he spent the remaining decade of his life under, quote, house arrest, first with an archbishop and later in a villa in Florence, which kind of sounds nice. He was also allowed to continue his scientific research and writing during that time, not in astronomy, but in physics. That's when he ended up writing what would later be Newton's first law of motion, the law of inertia. Galileo's friend Niccolini. We have letters from this guy Niccolini, who is Galileo's friend and also the Tuscan ambassador to the Vatican. Anyway, he wrote in the 1630s that the Pope assures us that Galileo is being treated well with, quote, a servant and every convenience. And then he continues, Galileo disobeyed the orders of 1616, but after he is sentenced, the Pope will consider with me as to what can be done to afflict him as little as possible. So no, he was not tortured to death. Was this all about ideas? Well, maybe, or you could say that the matter was complicated by a personal conflict between Galileo and his old friend Pope Urban VIII, with the publication of Galileo's book in 1632, a dialogue concerning the 2 chief world systems. This book is a debate over heliocentrism. Pope Urban VIII gave his blessing to the book, but he wanted Galileo to include the Pope's own views in the book as well, and Galileo did this. But he did this on the last page, and he put the Pope's ideas into the mouth of a character called Simplicio, which means simpleton. Anyway, let's listen to the very last page of this book from Galileo. Simplicio says, concerning the reasons for the ebbing and flowing of the ocean, I admit that your thoughts seem to be more ingenious than many others I have heard. And he's referring to what happened in the last section of the book. And in this last section, Galileo's bad, totally wrong view on the tides was proposed and is accepted here by Simplicio, but he continues, I do not therefore consider them true and conclusive. even though they're ingenious, they might not be true or conclusive. God, in his infinite power and wisdom, could have conferred upon the watery element its observed reciprocating motion using some other means. He would have known how to do this in many different ways which are unthinkable to our minds. Therefore, it would be excessive boldness for anyone to limit or restrict the divine power and wisdom to some particular fancy of his own. To which the other debaters in this dialogue respond, well, this is an admirable and angelic doctrine, and well in accord with another one also divine, which, while it grants to us the right to argue about the constitution of the universe, it adds that we can never truly discover the work of his hands. Now, is this sarcasm from 400 years ago? I don't know. But the Pope thought so. He thought his own views were being mocked at the end of this book, but in an absolutely astounding turn of events, it turns out that the Pope was right, or if he's not right, he's at least quoting a view that became popular again in the late 20th century. Look up the Duhem Quine thesis, or underdeterminization of theory, or Kuhn's work, this idea that all these different explanations for observed phenomena, too many to count, we kind of just have to choose one. I'm not exactly sure that that's what Pope Urban VIII was talking about. Anyway, the church never stated dogmatically that everyone had to believe in geocentrism. If you can find a place where they did, please let me know about it. The Inquisition did convict Galileo of, quote, vehement suspicion of heresy, but 3 out of the 10 cardinals that were looking at this trial refused to sign the verdict, and the Pope, of course, never promulgated it dogmatically. So this is not just about ideas, unless it is about ideas, but it's also about a squabble between 2 aristocrats. And this extremely interesting event in the history of science and religion certainly does not prove that faith and reason cannot go together. The truth is so much more interesting. It is true that Giordano Bruno taught that the sun was just another star in this infinite ocean of stars, and he was burned at the stake, but he was burned at the stake by secular authorities for non-scientific teachings. There's a lot that Giordano Bruno taught and did that we would not think of as scientific still. If you're looking for a martyr for modern science, he fits the bill perhaps better than Galileo. It is true that Copernicus had his book banned by religious authorities in 1616, but this was 2 years before the start of the 30 Years' War that would kill through direct violence and through plague and disease and famine a huge percentage of the population in Central Europe. So perhaps if banning this book could help have prevented that war, would it have been worth it? It didn't prevent the war. So I don't know the answer to that question. And it is true that Galileo was forced to give up astronomy, but as we already mentioned, he continued to be a productive scientist. So what should we say about science and religion? Are they always fighting with one another? I once heard about a rabbi and a meteorologist who got into a disagreement about a parking space. So yeah, if you're looking for evidence that science and religion always fights against one another, then you can find some. Do they ignore each other? That seems like a safe road to take. You could say that science deals with what happens and religion deals with why it happens, but then you're forced to deal with the historical fact that many of the great scientists in history were also religious people. So what do you do with that fact? Or you could say that science and religion therefore cooperate with one another, except when they don't. There is conflict because there are competing claims to truth. There are different methodologies. There is an interesting history here. I can't give you the last word on it, of course, but we can all agree you can look at this complicated and multifaceted interaction in multiple different ways, and whatever way you look at it, you can find evidence to support your theory, which again is that view that Pope Urban VIII had that he wanted Galileo to include, but he didn't.